Welcome to the briefing today on research that pays off, the economic benefits of federally funded R&D. My name is Vijay Vaitiswaran. I'm an editor at The Economist magazine and author of a new book called Need, Speed, and Greed about the innovation revolution that's just getting underway. It's an honor for me to be here this week, both because of the importance of the topic and the distinguished caliber of both the audience and our panelists, but also because I'm launching this book this week. So it's a particular treat to talk about a topic that I think is essential to the competitiveness of our country going forward. Today we have three distinguished speakers who I'll introduce in turn, and you have fuller bios as well. But in brief, we'll hear first from Fred Block, second from Katie Hunt, and third from Simon Tripp. Among the things that we want to cover today would be to look at really the importance of federal research in an age in which innovation and how we innovate is changing. We are living in quite dangerous times, I would argue, an age of wicked problems. At the global level, we're confronting new kinds of challenges. On the economic front, I think we're entering a period of what has been called frontier economics for developed economies like the United States, where finding new sources of growth will become more difficult, more challenging. And as we enter that, the ideas economy, where the lion's share of growth already comes, 80% of our GDP comes not from brawn, but it already comes from brain, from sectors of the economy where the greatest future contributions will come not from competing on cost, but from competing on better ideas, from mind and money connecting to markets in more productive ways. That's really the value of innovation. And I would argue to you that the role that the federal government plays in setting the preconditions for that innovation ecosystem we're going to hear about from our experts today is essential. And the kinds of problems we face at the global level, climate change is well understood, but if we look at the threat of deadly pandemics, we are in a new age of deadly pandemics, much more dangerous than, say, 1970. We're in some ways encountering the seamy underbelly of globalization and Googleization, which has brought us an extraordinary era of prosperity and interconnectedness that has allowed countries that stayed open in terms of trade, but also open in terms of ideas, as the United States has historically, to prosper tremendously, but equally has made us more vulnerable to new kinds of emerging threats like pandemics. And of course, we live in an age where the rise of China particularly, but India and Brazil and the other emerging giants behind it are transforming the global economy, providing new competitors, yes, and we'll talk a little bit about the need for the U.S. to remain competitive, but also providing new sources of ideas, of frugal engineering, of opening up possibilities for global innovation ecosystems. And so we need to think hard about how American companies, academic institutions, government laboratories continue to thrive in a world of networked innovation, and what's the right role for the federal government in enabling that infrastructure. I think we're going to hear about some of that as well from our experts. But I would say the kinds of wicked global problems we face are more difficult. You know, this is a once-in-a-500-year economic transformation we're going through with the rise of 1 billion more people out of poverty, which is a wonderful thing that will happen in the next generation if things continue on trend. But with it come the resource crunch that we're already seeing, whether it's fresh water, commodities, whether it's the atmosphere. Dealing with these problems will affect everyone on Earth. And the question is, can we turn that adversity into opportunity? And I think the history of American innovation is great. And the challenge now is to apply our innovative skills and adapt to a rapidly changing economy, a global economy. And at the national level, we see, of course, the challenge of the middle class squeeze. This age I've talked about of tremendous prosperity. In some ways, we live in a golden age of innovation. I argue in my book that what's happening now is akin in a quiet revolution happening in technologies, as happened 130 years ago with the great Victorian age of invention, when modern chemistry, the roots of grid electrification, of ultimately the symbiosis between the internal combustion engine and gasoline, which would produce the great dynamic industry that powered the 20th century and powered American greatness. Well, a lot of these things were laid down during that era of technological invention. We are living through such a time right now. If you look at not only the familiar technologies of the internet and software, but if you look at the big data and cloud computing revolution that is transforming industry after industry, including government, as you know very well in this room, but we look also to the less followed areas of genomics, where we're going to hear from one of the great experts, genomics, proteomics, and synthetic biology. It's not only that these technologies are at the knee of the curve of exponential growth, but it's also that they're converging in unexpected ways, and that will provide challenges and tremendous opportunities. Who would have thought just 5 years ago that one of the potential solutions to the clean energy challenge might come from synthetic biology, a field that didn't even really exist a decade ago? And so there's tremendous opportunity, and this is a great moment to think about this, for us to think of and invest in innovation. That's another point I wanted to make in introduction. We're clearly in a difficult economic moment, both fiscally but also in terms of the macroeconomics. But history shows, both at the macro and micro level, that great economies, just like great companies, invest in a downturn. And you invest in the long-term enablers of growth. We see that great companies invest during economic downturns. And the great economic historian, Alexander Field, who wrote a wonderful book, probably the best work of economic history in many decades, called The Great Leap Forward, an expert at UC Santa Clara, I recommend it to you highly, has shown from the data that the great decade of American productivity increase that fueled the innovations of the 50s, 60s, and 70s was not the 1940s, as is commonly thought, and according to popular lore, the U.S. mobilizing after the war, or for the war, I should say, the war effort, kind of got our factories going and pulled us out of depression. That's the story we've typically been told. But what he shows through very careful analysis is it was the 1930s, the era of the Depression. And it was through investment that, and also, frankly, out of necessity, frugal engineering, new business models, new means and modes of productivity that laid the foundation stones for the greatness that came in the golden age of America in the decades that followed. And I would urge us to think about investing in, even in these difficult times, we must invest in the enablers of future long-term growth. And innovation rests on today's investments in R&D, and the federal government plays an important role in stimulating that spark for the rest of the economy. And we'll hear about some of the evidence base for that assertion, again, from our experts. And of course, one other point I wanted to make is that we do live in a global economy, and the world is changing fast. I've alluded to China once. We live in a world where the rising powers of Asia are investing dramatically in science, technology, education, in innovation. I want to challenge the myth that innovation is a zero-sum game. It doesn't have to be. It's wrong to say just because China goes up, the U.S. has to come down. That's too simplistic. That's not how innovation works in an open world. We saw the peaceful rise of Japan contribute to American prosperity. Despite all of the gloom-saying that was done 30 years ago, we saw both economies rise, and America is much wealthier than we were in 1980 when people said Japan would eclipse us. And we can see the same. A rising tide can lift all boats, but we first have to patch the holes in our vessels first. Your boat will rise only if that happens. We do have work to do here, and among the things, we all know we need to think about our educational system, in particular the efforts we make in science, technology, education, but also the role of creativity. Let's not fall for the tiger mom fallacy that was so fashionable a year or two ago. It's not just about rote memorization and standardization and harmonization or deference to authority. One of the wonderful things about American higher education is that it encourages a certain kind of creativity, a willingness to challenge conventional thinking that's essential to the innovation process, and that's going to be essential in the ideas economy of the 21st century. So we have work to do in building on our historical strengths, both in education, but also work to do in reinvesting in our base of research and development that fuels the innovation fire. So without going much further, I just wanted to set a couple of comments out there to set the frame. Let me thank a number of the people who helped make today possible. A number of scientific societies, the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences, the American Chemical Society, the American Geosciences Institute, the American Geophysical Union, the American Institute, I said the Biological Sciences, of course, American Sociological Association, the American Statistical Association, the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. I say that with particular pride as a mechanical engineer from MIT myself by training, the Geological Society of America, and University Corporation for Atmospheric Research. And here at the House, we particularly thank Anna Unruh Cohen and the rest of the minority staff at the House Natural Resources Committee for making this briefing possible. So thank you to the House staff and also for all of you for coming. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Fred Block, is Research Professor of Sociology at University of California, Davis, and also the editor of a wonderful book that I recommend to you called The State of Innovation, the U.S. Government's Role in Technology Development. Fred.
Yeah. Well, this is on? Yeah. I want to thank Vijay for that kind introduction and thank everybody who has helped to put together this session. It's a great pleasure to be here and to be on this distinguished panel. The other people are quite distinguished. But I just want to make basically 3 points that are most of which will be somewhat familiar, and then they're going to be amplified and developed by the other speakers. But the starting point is that we all know that the U.S. economy would have looked very different if it weren't for the role of the federal government in funding research and development in the period since World War II. We're all aware of the computer, the internet, biotechnology, a whole series of technologies which emerged very much because of the federal effort. The problem is that we continue to have this kind of very serious problem of metrics. I mean, you know, and I don't have to tell people on the Hill, but that each time that an argument is made for another $1 billion for an R&D budget here or another $1 billion there, the question is always, well, how do we know this is being used well? How do we know that there are economic payoffs from this? And this is the issue that we're really trying to address today. And the problem is that we don't have, you know, the truth is that we don't have great metrics to make this argument in general. This is the problem we're trying to address in what we're presenting today. The standard way that economists have talked about this is in the growth accounting framework. And so this goes back to Robert Solow's work in the 1950s, and essentially he established that the residual, the things that we can't measure, the most important one being the increase in knowledge, is responsible for a very large chunk of our productivity advance. So this is the Bureau of Labor Statistics data, says that 58% of the growth of multi-factor productivity, the growth that can't be attributed just to labor and capital inputs over this long period has come as a result of R&D. But the problem is this is very broad. It doesn't give you, it doesn't kind of, it talks about R&D in general. It doesn't talk about the federal role. And let me just kind of state the kind of 2 basic problems in terms of metrics here. The first is that proving this case that federal R&D is really vital to economic growth, to job creation, et cetera, it runs into 2 big problems. The first is that we all know that there's no formula for overcoming technological barriers, that there's, you know, it's not a question of, you know, we can solve this problem and generate this new technology if we just take, you know, $2 billion and 40,000 scientists and invest. That the ability of the scientific community to make breakthroughs, to overcome technological barriers is inherently unpredictable, uncertain. And the breakthroughs that happen are difficult to predict, and that they tend to emerge serendipitously. So let me just give you one example that we know that wars have historically been associated with big technological advances, in part because they're hothouses in which the cooperation between government, business, and the scientific community is accelerated. So for our most recent wars, Iraq and Afghanistan, we know that two of the biggest technologies that have been accelerated as a result of those wars are first drones, and second, the enormous advances in prosthetics that, for our wounded war fighters, that we've made huge advances. But those are really that after every war in human history, there has been the hope that we could, rehabilitate the wounded. This has been a constant for human history. We're able to make these huge advances at this point because of advances in electronics, microtechnology, as well as material science. So that's an indication of the unpredictability, the uncertainty of the moment at which these things are going to pay off. The second problem is that there are these very big time lags in terms of the payoff. We use federal dollars to train top-flight scientists. We support their research, and maybe 25 years into a career that's been funded by the federal government, they make a breakthrough, and then it might turn out that it takes 15 to 20 more years before that breakthrough turns into a commercial product that produces very significant benefits. So how do you track? How do you prove that connection over 40 years or whatever? So this is the problem that we've had. And I want to stress that it's a bipartisan problem. I got these next two graphics from the webpage of the George W. Bush website, which has been George W. Bush presidency. In the 2006, the Bush administration had an American Competitiveness Initiative, and this was one of the graphics. It shows essentially the iPod, which was a new product back then, or relatively new product, and essentially they were showing, no, this wasn't just the genius of the private sector, but here was a little device which essentially incorporated 8 or 10 different strands of federal-funded R&D across different governmental departments over a long period of time. And the text went on to essentially make that argument. And again, one of the things that they stress is that some of those big breakthroughs reflected basic science, which had been done almost 40 years before it got incorporated into the iPod. So we do have a number of examples of more rapid payoff. One of my favorites is the Google example. The basic algorithm that makes Google search work was originally developed by Page and Brin, who were supported on an NSF grant. It was a big $4.5 million grant to Stanford for library digitalization. They had a little corner of the project, and they came up with the basic secret sauce that they then quickly took to the market. And as of today, we know that 4.5 million, or the little chunk of the 4.5 million that supported them, has now turned into 197 billion. Okay, so we're going to kind of lay out a number of my co-panelists have a number of other concrete examples that develop this. Let me shift over to the second point here, is that the basic innovation system that the federal government or the basic innovation system in the U.S. economy has changed very radically over the last 30 years. 30 years ago, a great deal of the key innovations, a good chunk of the key innovations, came from the in-house laboratories of big corporations, basically operating largely on their own. That's where we expected the innovations to come from. Over the last 30 years, that's changed dramatically. Even when big corporations like Dow are central to the innovation process, they're now working in collaboration with federal laboratories, university-based scientists, small technology startups, so that we've seen a dramatic shift in where innovation comes from. And I have a little bit of illustration of this. A colleague and I did a study of the R&D 100 awards. R&D magazine recognizes 100 products a year that incorporate innovative new technologies. And we tracked the trend lines for these innovations over the last 30 or 40 years. And what you see is that back in the 1970s, the Fortune 500 companies, either working together, working alone, or in collaboration, were responsible for a very large chunk of those innovations. What's happened as the Fortune 500 role has declined is that the role of public laboratories, universities, and small startup firms, often supported by the federal government, has expanded very dramatically. So we did this just comparison of 75 and 2006, and our finding in 2006 was that there were 88 domestic innovation winners, and we could trace federal dollars to 77 out of those 88. And it wasn't just to the firm, it was to the specific research group that had been recognized for the innovation. So this gives you an idea that the federal role has permeated the innovation economy. And it's not just computer and biotechnology. In fact, the R&D 100 awards are dramatically ignore computers and biopharmaceuticals particularly. So that the point being that we now have an innovation ecology that's heavily dependent upon federal labs, university-based research, small startup firms, and the federal role in networking those connections and in funding is absolutely essential to that process. So I have one example which I was going to mention very quickly. It might be controversial because I know on Capitol Hill there are people who don't like new generations of light bulbs, but there's a firm, Cree Lighting, that's the leader in LED light-emitting diode, and they're a typical firm from this new innovation ecology. They've started as a university spin-off from federally funded research. They were supported for years by the SBIR program. They won a whole series of SBIR awards. Today, they're selling these new light bulbs that are dramatically more cost-effective, more energy efficient. They're selling them at the order of $1 billion a year. So my concluding point is just simply that while we have this very powerful evidence, not the fully worked out metrics that you might like, but we have very powerful evidence of the productivity of federal R&D, but that the federal R&D spending is moving in the wrong direction. The trend line has been going in the wrong direction. And Ronald Reagan used to talk about how we shouldn't be eating our seed corn. And I found this graphic on Google, and substitute all of the other federal programs for NASA. When we're cutting back that R&D spending, we are eating our seed corn. We're interfering with, upsetting the possibilities of future economic growth and development. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. Let me just ask a question that comes to my mind, and we'll have a broader audience Q&A later. But you alluded to, with some of your very eye-opening charts on the R&D 100, the shift from what might seem to be the traditional, say, large corporate R&D lab to what sounds to me a little bit more of an open, networked model of innovation. This is certainly consistent with what I see across the world. We're moving much more towards open, network models of innovation. You made a persuasive case that you think federal funding plays a greater role in this. How do you measure? What are the metrics one can use when you actually talk about a slightly messier kind of way of doing this? I mean, it's one thing to look at R&D magazine, but if we were to do a more comprehensive thing, what should we do to get definitive results or better measures? Companies themselves struggle with this internally because when you simply are rewarding your managers based on doing siloed in-house research on the AT&T Bell Labs model, you can follow a project. But when you're rewarding a manager when they're working on a network where you have partners, suppliers, academics, government labs involved, well, what if the project fails and your manager says, it wasn't me, it was that guy over there, he really stinks. It becomes it's a slippery slope. Metrics are much harder. So give us a flavor of what economists look at this, how they look at this problem.
Well, I think that the real answer has been given by the private sector in the way in which venture capital has come to be organized. And the idea is that the key to venture capital is that it's probabilistic, that as a venture capital firm, you take 20 deals in the hope that one or two of them are going to pay off, and that you're spreading your bet. So this goes to the old canard, you don't want the government picking winners. Well, venture capitalists don't pick winners. They make a broad set of bets on potential winners with the idea that if they have a 10% success rate, that's going to pay for the rest. And so that has to be what the federal government is doing in terms of thinking about its R&D investments. It has to take that probabilistic, we're going to put this money out there, we're going to invest in 20 different projects to develop that next, or 20 different efforts to develop that next generation lithium-ion battery. And if one of them pays off, that's going to make the whole thing. So that's kind of the error of the Solyndra story. I mean, that the Department of Energy, was making a broad set of bets. It was inevitable that some of them were going to go south. But the real issue is, do enough of them pay off? And that's how we have to begin to think about.
Okay. Many questions raised as well by your answer, but we'll hold off on those until we get to the broader Q&A. Thank you. Let me introduce our next speaker as we prepare her slides. Dr. Katie Hunt. She's the R&D Director for Innovation, Sourcing, and Sustainable Technologies at the Dow Chemical Company. Katie?
Thank you, Vijay. And a proud past president of the American Chemical Society. So I want to thank all the chemical societies, the 10 scientific societies who sponsored this conference today, this important briefing. And what I'd like to give you is some examples where federally funded research in R&D has truly paid off. And so my role at Dow is to look at projects that we wouldn't ordinarily do, right? Or that we would do, but we wouldn't jump in quite so deeply. But by putting teams together, we can actually accelerate the pace of innovation. And so let me take one slide to introduce Dow. We are a science and technology leader. We have annual sales of $60 billion, founded in Midland, Michigan, but actually in 2009 looked to become more than a basic chemical company and become a specialty materials company, to basically take a broader look at innovation. And so in terms of acquiring Rohm and Haas. So I came from the Rohm and Haas side, and so after 25 years, I'm proud to be with Dow. We now have 52,000 employees globally. So I'd like to introduce R&D at Dow. right? One of the things we've heard is that there isn't so much R&D being done in large companies. As a matter of fact, we're spending more on R&D now than we did a couple of years ago. And we'll spend more probably this year as well, because it's important to invest in R&D. That's how you build your innovation pipeline. And it's critical to focus on the fact that it's not a spend, it's an investment, and good investments pay off. And as you heard from Fred, you have to make a broad range of investments to make sure that you hit those winners. We have over 300 master projects in our innovation portfolio, with a number of sub-projects that bring that total to 500 projects. We have materials expertise, engineering, high throughput, catalysis, and it goes on, but those are our big buckets, as we call them. Research and development is not just about research. It's about application development and then technical service to work with those products in the field. Because again, seeing how our customers use those products is also what helps us look at what are the next innovations, the next breakthroughs. We focus ourselves on global megatrends: energy, transportation and infrastructure, consumerism, and health and nutrition. The examples I'm going to focus on today are in the energy arena, but clearly there is a nexus between energy and food and water. All of these are critical elements that can't be thought of individually, but have to be focused on as a system. So in order to bridge the gap, and I would say that, as Vijay said, we are in dangerous times. We have some wicked problems to address. We need not think about, we have to think about education, not just telling our children everything that's out there and filling their brains with it, all right? But we have to encourage them that, look, there's still a lot to be done. And you, the next generations, are the ones that we need to work with to make this happen. So I break it down into how are we going to transform the future? It's through education, it's through collaboration, and it's through innovation. In education, it's building that understanding, K through gray. And the first time I heard this, I said, what does gray mean? Then I said, okay, I get it. Okay, collaboration, it's about establishing this innovation ecosystem for U.S. competitiveness. And I'm going to speak to that with some examples. Because what innovations are we looking for? I mean, you've been hearing it this morning. It's energy and identifying forms of alternate energy and how to conserve our energy. It's about food and ensuring the food supply and preserving the food supply by reducing waste. It's about water, ensuring pure water and available water and conserving that water. Security, health, I could go on. But as I said, I'm going to focus on energy. And let's look at, since not only do students follow the money, if you were to plot graduate students and where they're focusing, it follows the grant funding money. So that's the good news and the bad news, all right? The bad news is if we put the money in the wrong place, they'll go to the wrong place. The good news is if we focus that funding where we think they need to go, all right? For instance, if we're focusing, and my laser pointer won't work on that, I should know that technology, all right? We need to think about renewables. I'm not saying we don't need to put funding on oil and gas, but we also need to figure where are we looking. And as you heard, we need to have a broad portfolio and enough of a concentration. We need to collaborate because there's no one group that can do this all, right? And do it fast enough. So that's why we need to recreate the way we do innovation, the way we look at new ideas. And it's not all going to come from within companies, right? It's going to be companies, industry, large and small, working with national labs, working with academics, and working with government. And as we look at this innovation, it's about delivering solutions. All right. One of the solutions I'm starting with started with federal funding. Actually, what happened was the call of the Solar America Initiative by the Department of Energy that says we want to make solar affordable. We want to make residential solar affordable. So that was in 2006. There was a call. In 2007, we were awarded. We had a team working with NREL, working with universities, and working with small companies. And what do we have here? We launched last fall the Dow Powerhouse solar shingle. What I have here is actually a mini of the shingle, because otherwise it's too big to carry them all around, but it looks something like this. It's made so that it is the roof. So the way indoor plumbing revolutionized our bathrooms, okay, solar shingles are reinventing the rooftop. So this is both the shingle and it is your source of power. So depending how many of these solar shingles you put on your roof, you can actually generate 60% if your home is not that energy efficient, or if you have a net zero home, it could generate close to 100% of your electrical power. Actually, I should say of your power. Okay? What happens is you take these up on the roof, they can click right together. I can't do it when they're not laying down. You have a jumper that goes in the end. You put the next row on. We've worked with contractors, we've worked with roofers, and you can see this just goes right on the roof. It's not on top of the roof. It can survive 110-mile-an-hour wind-driven rain. When we went to UL to have this tested, they tested it. Well, they looked at it and they said, the good news is there's nothing like this out there. The bad news is there's nothing like this out there. Okay? And so that's the whole point of working with NREL, the National Renewable Energy Lab, working with other national labs to make sure that we have standards for testing this that can be used across the industry. Not just something that Dow devises, right, but something that can be used for the whole industry. So for me, it's very exciting to see us do this, because what we have now, this is the facility in Midland, Michigan, actually our pilot facility, and why we've rolled this out on a limited basis in Colorado, because it's a wonderful solar state. It's also because we're working with a home builder and putting this in community by community so that it's part of the house when you buy it. You hook it to the inverter in your attic, you hook it to the grid. When you're not using the power, you send it back to the grid. When you are using the power, all right, it's yours. So I said we started this with the Solar America Initiative. In 2009, we had manufacturing credits in order to build a plant in Midland, Michigan. And actually, it was to build the pilot facility. We are working with the Michigan Economic Development Corporation as well. We will, by 2015, bring 1,275 jobs. In the last 12 months alone, we've brought in 200 new jobs. I actually had my picture taken the other day for my badge. Actually, it was several months ago, and there were 100 new people starting that day. And they said, you can go first. I said, no, when am I ever going to have this chance again? This is too good. But I expect that I will have that chance again. There were also construction jobs for putting this facility together. You can see this was put on a brownfield. There was actually an old-style power plant here originally, so how wonderful to replace it with a facility to make renewable energy. We are now part of the DOE Sunshot Initiative to get us to $1 a watt solar installed, driving down the cost of adoption. If you look, here's the comparison between the solar panels and now the fact that you can stand on these solar shingles on the roof, and simply the roof is not only your shelter but your source of power. As the Secretary of the Navy said, I want to see us looking at our roofs as not just shelter but as sources of power. To accelerate the pace of innovation, we've been looking at a whole series of collaborations, and some of it is around education, the importance of energy efficiency, working with Building Technologies program at the DOE, working with the Advanced Energy Efficiency Technologies. We're doing this in the US, we're doing this in China, because it is about rising all boats. It is about reducing our carbon footprint around the world. We have been accelerating energy storage solutions, so I'll switch to batteries. This is a program where we're looking at the next generation of battery technology. This one is a newer program, but this is a joint venture with Dow and Kokum, and is called Dow Kokum. So I just want to give you a flavor. It's also about accelerating wind energy and solutions for wind energy. So we're working with Oak Ridge National Lab, the Michigan Economic Development Corporation, the DOE, with MAG and Astraeus. And why Oak Ridge National Lab? Because they have a center for carbon fiber. All right? So we have this wonderful ecosystem out there. What we need to do is bring it together, make sure that it remains vital, and make sure that we move forward. As Bill Gates says, we need energy solutions with unbelievable scale and reliability. He was at the ARPA-E conference last week, and not only did he say this, but he himself is investing in energy technologies. But it's not in a single technology. It's about having a broad base. Or to leave us with one final quote from Thomas Edison, I'd put my money on sun and solar energy. What a source of power. I hope we don't wait until oil and coal run out before we tackle that. So, thank you.
Great. Thank you, Katie. You made certainly a good argument for why innovation ecosystems matter. I was intrigued, though, by, for example, the company's decision to invest in manufacturing for this in the United States. There's perhaps the number one concern right now is jobs in America and is the prospects of reviving manufacturing. Can you talk a little bit about how, as we think about what are the spillover effects, what are the knock-on effects of an R&D dollar that's spent? Fred's given us, as an economist would, a rigorous answer saying you can't always give as precise a date and time when that dollar is going to create a job. But here we're seeing from the anecdote that you're creating these jobs here. What led to that decision? And give us a sense of what might it take to get high-tech manufacturing going again.
Well, I think this is a very exciting time for manufacturing, especially advanced manufacturing, because this advanced manufacturing is what you need close to your R&D. So that was one of, certainly we looked at economic reasons, but when we looked at the economics and we said, this is a product that's going to be sold in the U.S., it's to address the American market. 95% of our rooftops in residential housing are asphalt shingles. They're heavy, which is why I have minis here. So you think of transportation costs, that's something that can eat right into your profits. Right? Then you look at, well, we make them here, we build them here. We had a workforce, actually one thing I went over quickly on my slide was the fact that we have retrained some auto workers who worked on those robotic lines to work in our industry. So it is about retraining. It is about having the right workforce. It is about being close to your R&D. And I'm not saying we won't make other forms of other products and source plants there close to where they would deliver. But we're looking at this as a $5 billion addressable market. And so I think that will keep us here in the U.S. with strong partnerships. And I have to say the enthusiasm and the entrepreneurial spirit of this group is another piece that brought us here.
That's great. Well, that's a great example of opportunity, I think. There is something of a revolution happening in manufacturing, not only because of what's happening here in clean tech, but if you look at the advances that are being pioneered in 3D printing, for example, in software-assisted design, we see American companies at the leading edge in the invention phase of this. And I distinguish invention from innovation, of course. Innovation is not just about technology. It's not just about patents or papers published. Innovation, properly defined in my view, is fresh thinking that creates value. That value has to be for customers, for shareholders, or for society at large. And if we get caught up only with the technology, as sometimes happens, we miss the harder part of that innovation process. But we have, I think, a real opportunity for reviving and building the next generation of manufacturing in the U.S., especially because our principal competitor in some of this, China, is actually facing very rising costs. In the current Economist, I've got a lead article with a lot of economic analysis and on-the-ground reportage arguing that we're at the end of cheap China. The cheap coastal regions in China that are the workshop to the world have seen double-digit rises, not only in costs, but benefits, in regulatory burdens, and there is no easy substitute. It isn't going to be Vietnam's not the new China. It's not going to happen. And the interior of China is not going to replace coastal China either. The world is stuck with more expensive China, I argue. But this is actually good news for those of us who are interested in a revival of the manufacturing base in the U.S. I'm sure we may want to pick up on that as we move along in Q&A. But let's go to our final speaker this morning, Simon Tripp, Senior Director of Battelle Memorial Institute's Technology Partnership Practice. Simon.
Thanks, Vijay. Well, you'll see that innovation is near and dear to the heart of Battelle when you look at our tagline in the top right-hand corner of that slide, the business of innovation. Actually, Battelle is the world's largest non-profit scientific research institute, about $6.5 billion in revenues, 20,000 personnel, headquartered in Columbus, Ohio. We manage 6 of the U.S. Department of Energy labs. I'm pleased to see you mentioned Oak Ridge and NREL, both labs that Battelle is deeply engaged in the operations of. We also have 3 global business units in health and life sciences, in national security, and in energy, the environment, and materials. So we're actually doing hard science, hard R&D. Within Battelle, we have a group that I co-direct called the Technology Partnership Practice, and we specialize at looking at science and technology as a driver of the economy, of the national economy, of state economies, of regional economies. And so we look a lot at what is the payback on research, what does it bring to states, to the federal government, to the regions that sponsor that type of research. Thanks, Kate. So I'm going to give you an example of just one federally sponsored program and the effects that it has had. It happens to be a big federally sponsored program. It's the Human Genome Project, and I think the nice thing is that while Katie had her very nice prop to use, in many respects, each of you is my prop. Each of you contains billions of cells. Not just your own cells, you've actually got billions of microorganisms living on your skin, living inside you, just to gross you all out this morning. Some of you had breakfast, so you had eggs, you've got chicken DNA inside your stomachs at the moment. DNA is the most ubiquitous molecule in many respects outside of basic carbon that you can imagine. What's fascinating is you have these 4 chemical letters, T, G, C, and A, which together produce the complete compendium of absolutely every form of life on this planet. It's life's instruction set, so to speak. Mapping the complete human genome then was to take the most complex organism on the planet in many respects. Actually, our genome isn't the largest. Wheat's genome is significantly larger than your genome, but nevertheless, a very complex genome. 6 billion individual letters in your genome, coding something like 21,000 different individual genes within the human. To do this, back in the late 80s, when this initiative was first considered, many in science thought it simply could not be done, that the task was simply way too complex. In fact, what happened was it took a multinational team. You can hear my accent, I'm from the UK originally, and part of the work was done in the UK. But the majority of the work done here in the United States and funded by 2 federal agencies, by the U.S. Department of Energy and the National Institutes of Health. So it took about 13 billion years for DNA to evolve, despite what I guess some people in D.C. think it was 600 years or 6,000, but 13 billion years, but we decoded it in 13 years instead of 13 billion. The Human Genome Project, what is it? Well, it refers to a 13-year project formally begun in October of 1990, although some federal expenditures predate that, and completed in 2003 to identify all of the human genes and to completely sequence all of our base pairs in our DNA. And in doing that, parallel studies and technology development took place. So as we worked along on the Human Genome Project, this slide's way too small to see, and I would say that our complete report is on the web at the NIH website as well as Battelle's website. But starting in 1990, and moving on down, the programming had required the development of specific technology to make this happen, intense computing hardware. This was truly a multidisciplinary effort sponsored by the federal government that brought together everything from biologists, as you would expect, and geneticists, but computer scientists, information resource specialists, physicists. It was a very multidisciplinary initiative. In terms of total funding, it was $3.8 billion, which if we do that in today's dollars, or 2010 constant dollars, about $5.6 billion. A lot of money. So what we were asked to do was to, now that we've got the perspective of hindsight, is look back over the course of the Human Genome Project and see what benefits it has generated, and has the government seen a payback for that $3.8 billion in federal government expenditures. We looked at this in two dimensions. Economists talk about forward and backward linkage economic impacts. Basically, backward linkage impacts are the quantitative impacts of the expenditures of the program itself, and also the expenditures of the industry that has grown up around genomics because of this program of the Human Genome Project. And I'll talk about the numbers that we get out of that. But in many respects, the pure dollars and cents of that are just perhaps the less important part of the story, because the Human Genome Project was done to advance scientific knowledge and to generate a number of different functional benefits, these down the right-hand side, to expand scientific knowledge and be a launching pad for further scientific progress, to be the technological underpinning for future innovations and technologies, and as I'll show you, it's certainly been that, to advance human health care in prevention, in diagnosis, and in treatment through better knowledge of our physical structure, but also to apply the knowledge that comes out of those genomics tools and technologies in a number of different other areas, in veterinary medicine, in agricultural biosciences, in energy, the environment, forensics and security, and a host of other regions. Of course, by advancing knowledge, it advances education, and we've also seen significant forensic science applications and human justice applications as well, and many additional benefits. So our task was to look at both sides of that equation. So what has been the effect? Well, here's what has happened in terms of the growth of the genomics and genomics-enabled industry in 2010, as just a snapshot of 1 year of what's happened as a result in part of the Human Genome Project. To establish this, we actually had to build a ground-up data set. There's no NAICS code for genomics and genomics-enabled industry, so we had to go out and actually build up a data set of industry that's involved in genomics and what part of their industry is in genomics. So we have part of the pharmaceutical industry, but only that part that in 2010 was genomics-based. Part of the instrument sector in the United States, but only the part of that sector that's making genomics instruments. When we calculate that, what we found is that in 2010 alone, we had a $67 billion industry in the US in genomics, $20 billion in personal income being generated for Americans, and 310,000 jobs. Not bad for a $3.8 billion investment. What's interesting is when you look at that far right-hand column for federal tax revenue, and what we see is if we had $3.8 billion spent over 13 years on the Human Genome Project, in just 2010, there was $3.9 billion given back to the federal government in taxes from the industry that's spun out of it. So there, right there, does federal government research pay off? Yes, actually, intangible tax benefits coming back in this instance. Of course, not in every single area of federal research, but in very many. You would see this kind of federal return coming back in terms of actual industry creation and jobs being generated and taxes being paid. In terms of the cumulative impact, what's happened over time, looking from the first expenditures back in 1988, as the Genome Project was being considered, through to 2010, the last year for which we were doing the analysis, the total impact has been $796 billion of economic activity in the United States, $244 billion in personal income for American workers, and $49 billion in federal taxes. So in this case, yes, federal government research has paid off and paid off in spades. As I said, though, I think that is just one part of the equation and probably not the most interesting part of the story. The real story of what's happened through the Human Genome Project and follow-up programs, such as the Genomes to Life program that DOE has been operating, are the functional impacts of genetics and genomics that we're now seeing coming to fruition. So in terms of functional impacts, we've had the impacts of the actual generation of new technologies, of new gene sequencing technologies, and now we can go from multiple rooms and banks of computers to decode the human genome to a single desktop unit that can do it. Life Technologies Corporation, which actually was the sponsor of the research that we did through their foundation, now has their Ion Torrent machine that sits on a desktop. They're talking about being able now to decode the human genome that did cost $3.8 billion, doing it for $1,000. So the era of when physicians can have access to affordable data on your actual personal genome is now coming to fruition. And it's because of that technology development that occurred in part because of the federal spending on the Human Genome Project. Through the expansion of scientific knowledge, we now have these tremendous areas of application taking place in human health, in food and agriculture, in the environment, veterinary medicine, industrial biotech, and forensics, justice, and security. And when we take those and you start to add to each of those all of the different areas, all the different technological applications that you have, you can see that it's legion. Molecular diagnostics, these being diagnostics that can tell definitively what disease you have. Pharmacogenomics and drug discovery, pharmacogenomics being the customization of drugs to your genomic profile. Moving towards an era where medical errors and drug interaction effects that have negative effects on you could well be a thing of the past. Regenerative medicine and stem cell biology and tissue engineering. Across into the livestock area, zoonotic diseases, ID and characterization. The application of genetics to renewable fuels development, to the production of biomass where the lignin in the cell wall can be broken down more easily, or where you're producing functional chemicals actually through the plant pathway through genetic engineering. Into environmental sciences, where you can engineer a transgenic organism to digest pollution and to take some of the legacy of our old industrial processes and clean it up through our new processes. So really just a tremendous variety of new technologies and resources. I think one of the key takeaways is that the vast majority of those were not anticipated back in 1988 when the Human Genome Project was being considered. The thought was, this is a very interesting and necessary scientific project to do. Yes, we expect that we're going to have to develop instrumentation along the way as we do this. But the reality of that big science program has been that it has launched an industry and helped launch tremendous application of that new genomics knowledge and create large-scale economic impacts. I'd like to leave you with a quote, and I think it's a rather interesting one. An investment in knowledge pays the best interest. It comes from an American rather a long time ago, in that was said by Benjamin Franklin, perhaps one of our better-known early American scientists. What we see is that the sequencing of the human genome has generated a really startling advance in our knowledge of fundamental biological structures and molecular processes, and that we've seen great dividends for that today. Into the future, the growth of genomics and all of the different omics on top of it, proteomics, metabolomics, is going to bring tremendous benefits out into the future. And federal funding made a very large part of that possible. Our full report on the impact of the Human Genome Project is available. It's on the National Institutes of Health Genome website and on Battelle's website as well. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Simon. One dimension of the Genome Project you didn't touch on, but that connects with some of the trends in how innovation is changing, has to do with transparency. I think I'm right in saying that the project put up its data on the web.
Yep.
Tell me about some of the surprises. What did you find? I mean, did you find that
the Genome
the lion's
Project was
share of
rather
benefits?
fascinating in that you had this federal funding going in, but as the research unraveled each day, as new sequences came out, they were posted to the web. And so rather than having to wait 13 years for a finished genome in order for scientists to then begin working on it, that research was parceled out over that time period. Now, you might think, okay, the US federal government is spending the money to do this program. We're putting this out on the web. Anybody all over the world can access that genomics data. Why didn't we keep it to ourselves? Well, the reality is that if you actually look at the genomics industry that's grown up, in part spurred by the Human Genome Project, it is nearly all in the United States and the UK. The countries that did the work, that sponsored the work, are the ones that have reaped the rewards from this technology. Simply seeing the data didn't let other people get the leap on us. There was that tacit knowledge that federal government funding of American scientists creates that is incredibly hard to duplicate. You can't just take knowledge and port it. You have to have know-how that goes along with that knowledge, and that's what this work created.
I think that insight is very powerful. There's a great strength in openness, in being able to collaborate, get feedback, be connected with what used to be thought of as brain drain, people now think of as brain circulation. But nevertheless, the spillovers come closest to those who move first and who are closest to the kind of cutting-edge research. The private sector is learning this. If you look at a company like Novartis, a big pharmaceuticals giant, I spoke recently with their head of R&D. They're making big investments in diabetes research. But what they're doing is they're putting all of that up on the web, the results, down all their work in progress. And I said, but this doesn't make any sense. Yeah, this is a big market. It could be a multi-billion-dollar blockbusters coming out of this. This is not like, say, drugs for diseases of the developing world, where there's not really any money to be made, and you can understand why, working on a collaborative method, you can solve problems faster. We all get it, but how are you going to make any money? You have shareholders. I asked him. He said, look, the science is so hard in this area that we have to collaborate. Nobody can do it in-house. The smartest people in your business don't work for you anymore. You have to take on open network models of collaboration. But we still believe that because we worked first in this, closest with this, we can get to market faster because we have that in-house knowledge. So to me, that seems a more enlightened way, almost a necessary way of doing innovation in this new age. And that is one of the lessons, of course, that came from your project. Great. I think we're just about out of time. Let me just offer a thought, partly in response to the final comment. I would say, as a free marketeer myself, as you'd expect a man from The Economist to be, I'm join the tough questioning that comes on any subject like this. I think we have to not only look at level of spending, but ask what is the effectiveness. This question is worth asking, and that's why I think that thoughtful kinds of studies that are being done and better ones to come in future are necessary. And we know that simply spending money on science isn't the answer in and of itself. We know the Soviets spent lots of money on science, but they didn't have the bottom-up innovation ecosystem clusters that could turn invention into innovation, on my definition of this. And in a sense, the seed, to stick with our analogy, fell on barren soil. So we need to look at the whole picture, as I think our experts, you'll agree, have talked about open systems, the role of the private sector, the interconnection between federal investments and the dynamic private sector economies. And I'll leave you with the last word from two techno-libertarian billionaires who are sort of icons of the new economy, who've been referenced already today, Sergey Brin and Larry Page, the founders of Google, in the first published work in which they described what would later become the successful algorithms for Google. They explicitly thanked the federal government investment, and so they give credit directly, even though they come from the markets, and they come from a very libertarian perspective, as a lot of the Silicon Valley community does. So I think that there's at least some reason to think this is worth doing, and probably a lot more reason than that. I think you'll agree that we should thank our speakers today for a thought-provoking discussion. Thank you.
Well, I guess the two key points are that the federal R&D spending is absolutely essential for the future economic growth, and the reason that that's true is because of the shift in the way the innovation system has been organized. So the federal government is more central to the whole process than it was at earlier points in time when the large corporations did a lot of the R&D in-house. So, I had read a little bit about the solar shingles, but I hadn't seen the mock-up of them or the model. So I found it very exciting to see the way in which Dow had worked with a series of collaborators and come up with this product, and they were doing everything the right way in terms of working with builders, working with others to get the product ready for the market. So I was very impressed by that. Private firms are tremendously constrained in terms of the way in which they can spend money, and they're not able, even the largest corporations aren't able to spend a lot on fundamental research, on the research that lays the basis for future breakthroughs. So if we simply relied on the private sector, the research wouldn't be happening. So I think that was the import of Simon's presentation, that no private sector firm could have launched something on the scale of the Human Genome Project by themselves.
Money spent on research is an investment. It's an investment for the future. And we have to do it wisely, and we have to do it well. And that's why it's so important that we have partnerships with universities, industry, academia, national labs, and active federal government engagement. I was actually very interested as a sociologist, would write about innovation, but how wonderful is that? Because really it's the societal impacts of innovation that are the hardest to measure. You can measure profits, you can measure costs, but it's really wonderful to look at the benefits of energy and the change in your quality of life and health and water and all the differences that chemistry makes and how it's all around us. You can't underestimate the benefit of receiving a grant. The fact that industry may look at it and say, well, is this worth doing? But when you have the great minds that are in the Department of Energy, at NIST, in the Department of Commerce, at the national labs, at the universities, coming together and saying, this is really important research. This is how we have to do this. People's heads turn and they say, wow, this is important. We need to pull together and do this. So I think it's about that focus and that partnership. And no one can do it alone. I think actually the Solar America initiative from the Department of Energy, in my opinion, has been hugely successful. It really brought together a team that might have come together, but would certainly not have come together as quickly. And that was the team that put together the Dow Powerhouse solar shingle. I mean, it has truly reinvented the 21st century roof. It's no longer just a shelter. It's a source of power. You can power your home with your home. And now we're working with the Department of Energy to get ourselves to $1 a watt solar installed. And that will make solar affordable across America. That will put our own ability to generate our own power in our own homes. And what was so wonderful about this is that, yes, as Dow, we knew a lot about materials, we knew a lot about photovoltaics, but coming together with the National Renewable Energy Lab, working with contractors and homeowner associations to understand what they wanted, looking at building this facility in Midland, Michigan, right? Dow's corporate headquarters and where we do our R&D. It's just been really exciting. There's nothing more exciting for a scientist or a chemistry professional to solve problems. And the federal funding was a catalyst that made this all happen. And so here you have a Dow Powerhouse. This is a mini because it gets a little heavy for me to carry a whole array around with me, but it even has instructions on it in 2 languages, a bilingual solar shingle, nail here or clave aquí. And you have a second shingle, or you put the whole row this way, jumper around, and you lay your next row on. In an unmentored build, the roofers just loved it. You don't have electricity on the roof. You'd have one drill hole. You connect it up to an inverter in your attic, and then when the electrician comes in, they make that connection. So the roofer is a roofer, but they can put power into your home.
I think that federal research really can have some very strong dollar paybacks, not just in terms of economic impacts across our overall economy, but even to the federal government itself. So when we looked at the economic impact of the Human Genome Project, which cost the federal government $3.8 billion over 13 years to perform, we actually found that just in 1 year, 2010, the growth of the genomics industry that's come out of that paid more in taxes than the entire Genome Project spent in 13 years. So all of the benefits that have come out of genomics in life sciences, in biomedicine, in agriculture, in environmental sciences, in forensics and security, all of those additional benefits have occurred as well. We've really just seen tremendous benefits coming out of this one federal government research program, the Human Genome Project. Yeah, I thought the data that we saw presented in regards to the decline in the proportion of research that's undertaken by very large Fortune 500 corporations, and the way that that's now declined so significantly, but is being picked up by small business and by our university and national lab infrastructure, I thought was a key takeaway.